This is HubWonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi. Welcome to HubWonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. The one unifying task shared by our governor and legislature is to negotiate a budget for the July 1st start of the Commonwealth's fiscal year. While the House and Senate have stable Democrat majorities, the corner office has passed from a popular Republican, Charlie Baker, to the newly elected Democrat, Maura Healy, who just last week started the budget ball rolling with the release of a $55.5 billion proposal to signal her administration's priorities. Promising to make Massachusetts more livable for everyone with investments in early education, transportation, housing, and the environment, Ms. Healy also acknowledged the need to compete with other states for talent and investment. To that end, the governor also revealed a $750 million tax relief package, whose provisions on estate and capital gains tax may be intended to mitigate the blow to competitiveness caused by the multi-billion-dollar income surcharge passed last year. What does this budget tell Bay Staters about our new governor's vision for Massachusetts? And will this first step in the long process of budget talks cast Ms. Healy as a rubber stamp for progressive prerogatives, or as a responsible steward of our Commonwealth's economic and fiscal health? My guest today is Pioneer Institute's Senior Fellow in Economic Opportunity, Eileen McAnneny, who recently joined Pioneer after leading the Massachusetts Taxpayers Association, the premier budget watchdog in the Commonwealth, for the past 8 years. Ms. McAnneny will share her views on the governor's first budget proposal and tax relief package and assess how its key features are likely to improve our livability and competitiveness if they survive the gauntlet of the legislative process. When I return, I'll be joined by Massachusetts budget expert and Pioneer Senior Fellow, Eileen McAnneny. Okay, we're back. This is HubWonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi, and I'm now pleased to be joined by Pioneer Institute's Senior Fellow in Economic Opportunity and my new colleague, Eileen McAnneny. Welcome to HubWonk, Eileen.
Thanks, Joe. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. This is your first time on the podcast, and we're going to be talking about what might be considered perhaps a dry subject, but a necessary subject because we have a new governor and we need a new budget each year. It's that one thing that needs to start and finish because we need the money to fund all the programs. But our listeners may already know that this budget H1 that our new governor Healy just proposed, it's called H1. It weighs in at $55.5 billion. And by my reckoning, that's more than $1 billion a week. So it's a lot of money we're going to be talking about. And there's some, let's say, related proposals she has in there. So let's start very high level and work our way into the details so our listeners can keep up with all these numbers. So let's start at the beginning, which is this. I think our goal as a Commonwealth, the stated goal of the new governor was to make the Commonwealth more affordable and more competitive with other states. So I think perhaps we use that lens to interpret what the budget looks like. So let's start at the beginning. Share with our listeners $55 billion. How, just in general, historically, how does that break down? And let's, if we can, compare past and future.
Sure. So as you say, the governor's budget is her proposal for the state's operating plan for fiscal year 2024, which begins July 1st. And she's given extra time the first year she's the governor because it's a complicated document. And as you say, it's over $55 billion. That's in line item spending, but the actual overall spending package for the state weighs in at more like $62.5 billion. That's because some things get funded right off the top and they don't actually get appropriated through the budget, but it is a lot of money. And the governor's first budget really is an indication of what her priorities are.
Okay, so these are her priorities, but of course, this is the ball just starting to roll right now. Now we don't have a king; we have a governor who then passes it on along to the legislature, who has many members, each with different priorities that they're going to massage this, right? They're going to take some things out and add things. This is what the governor thinks is important. So it's a first draft of a budget, if I'm right.
Absolutely, it's the starting salvo, if you will, right? And so the governor files her budget. It goes to House Ways and Means. They get a chance to either reject, revise, accept either the numbers or proposals in her budget. Then the Senate does the same thing. There is always differences between the House and the Senate, goes into a conference committee. Then it goes back to the governor, who will have the opportunity to veto provisions. The cycle is honestly never ending throughout the year, because then once they enact what they call the final gap budget, then they start on supplemental budgets. And so it's really a never ending cycle.
Well, okay, so we won't get too caught up in the details. Let's try to do broad strokes. If the governor's trying to communicate to the legislature and we, the residents of the Commonwealth, what is she trying to say? Well, let's start with the beginning with what she's proposed as far as spending. Where are you are an expert in the budget? Where are the clear differences, the initiatives that look like this is something that reflects a priority of the governor?
Yeah, so I think that the governor's budget reflects that she is focused on the cost of housing, the cost of early education, the need to improve transportation, and then a whole bunch of other like investments in workforce training.
So let's unpack that. Housing. Okay, we've done a couple shows on the fact that it costs a lot to live here housing-wise, both in rent and to buy a new home. Where does this budget reflect an interest in helping people, either renters or home buyers, to afford to live here in the Commonwealth?
Well, so I think the most noteworthy thing is she's separating out housing in its own secretariat. So she will have a direct report responsible for housing in Massachusetts. And so that is, that's certainly new, but that Secretary of Housing is charged with making sure that we expand shelter capacity. So for those that can't afford housing, housing replacement for new arrivals is actually the term she uses in her budget remarks. Access to affordable housing through rent vouchers and a whole host of other programs that I think will help those unable to afford housing. There is less involved in what I'll call market rate housing initiatives.
So for those who are unfortunately unable to afford a house, we call this is a very complex problem. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole and talk about homelessness and those in the most need. But we have on this show talked about the need for more housing. If we want to make housing more affordable, we need more of them. Is there anything in there that encourages developers to roll up their sleeves and invest in new housing?
So it does fund programs, certainly, that are already on the books, but I did not see any new program in that respect. Although, as you know, Joe, from glancing at it, the budget is several hundred pages, so that it could be in there, and I've yet to discover it.
Well, I don't know. Again, you're the expert. I just thought I was encouraged, if I'm going to sing the governor's praises. I did see a housing development incentive program that was increased from 10 million annual cap to 50 million, which again, I am not an expert in this. To me, this says, okay, you may get a tax break if you're willing to build housing, I guess, that falls along the affordable and commutable range. So am I reading that properly? That for market rate housing in quote unquote gateway cities, that to me was encouraging.
And you're absolutely right. And what I would say is, as we know, Governor Baker spent a lot of time on housing and trying to increase the housing stock, building more housing across the pricing spectrum. And I think Governor Healy certainly builds on some of those programs with incremental additional funding.
Sure. So let's move on to one more element of housing. There are some, you mentioned rental supplements. How is there anything profound there, or is it sort of steady as she goes?
I think, again, it's trying to expand upon programs acknowledging that housing costs are becoming increasingly unaffordable for a wider swath of the population, and so focused on that. We can, get into in her tax package if you want to. There's also a provision that would try to help renters by increasing the deduction and help seniors stay in their home with income tax deduction for property taxes paid.
Sure, I think you make a good point, and I don't want to conflate the two concepts. We have a budget that is what the government is spending, and then there was a filed alongside what's called a $750 million Healy-Driscoll tax relief package. So I don't want to conflate the two concepts. I do want to sort of tack that on there because I think it does also reveal a great deal of what the governor's priorities are. So let's come back to the
Sure.
to that. You mentioned early education improvement. That seemed quite comprehensive, quite a lot of detail in there. Is the logic behind that? Again, I'm talking in broad strokes. We want to make early education, that is pre-K, I suppose, a priority so that people who are, let's say, two-income families, that they're able to work and have education and have their children prepared for school. This helps people join the workforce and be productive. Is that the logic behind these kinds of early education programs?
It is. I think that one of the biggest challenges confronting the Commonwealth is the workforce shortage. And that's due to a lot of things, certainly an aging population, people leaving the state, and folks leaving the workforce to care for young children or the elderly, right? So there's a lot of reasons why people aren't working. And I think the governor acknowledges that. And so her approach is multifaceted. You have to increase childcare availability, certainly for people who can pay, and also subsidies for those who need some help. And so she does both.
So a scenario would be a nurse with two young children at home might be able to work if her children have adequate daycare or early education. So that senior in Massachusetts gets the nurse that she needs, the nurse gets her job, and the kids get some early education. That's
absolutely, yeah. It's an ecosystem, if you will.
Okay. Now you mentioned the next priority. I wrote it and then completely transportation. Seems there's a great deal in there. Of course, we're treated to daily stories of the T, whether it be ceiling tiles falling or trains colliding. Or we would all love to see the T fixed. What is in this budget for transportation? Not just the T, but in everything.
There's a lot of money, and the money comes from the income surtax that was passed by voters last November, because as you may recall, it says the money has to go or is intended for education and transportation. And so the governor's budget estimates that there'll be about $1 billion from the income surtax that comes in fiscal year 2024, and she divides it between education and transportation. So there's about $490 million in new investments in transportation. A lot of it is for highways, right? Making sure the bridges are sound and safe. But a lot more of it goes to capital investments in the MBTA to improve stations so we don't have falling ceiling tiles and the like.
Indeed, I don't want them falling on me either. So those of us, I'm glad you brought this up. I didn't mention it. Again, I think it seems to me from my reading of the budget, she was very good at separating out that additional money. We'll call it the millionaires tax or fair share tax or whatever word we want to use for it, but we're estimating roughly $1 billion in addition to the revenue that comes in. Let me just start a little bit back. We talked about how much is spending. All of this is based on revenue, and most of it's coming from income taxes. And we've been pleasantly surprised, even through COVID, that income taxes have been robust. How much does this proposal increase spending over the year prior? Essentially, not what did the governor last year propose. I think Governor Baker had proposed a much smaller budget, and ultimately, as you say, when it made it all the way through the gauntlet of the process, it was a larger budget. But let's say, relative to what was spent last year, what is the governor proposing? Is it a larger number, smaller number, or much larger number? So
it's a larger number. It represents about a 4.1% year-over-year increase in spending, but it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison, because part of that increased spending comes from the income that will come from the income surtax, which didn't exist last year, right? So $1 billion in increased spending is due to the estimated increase in income taxes the state anticipates collecting.
And as a matter of housekeeping, those of us who were concerned about the effects of the millionaire's tax on, let's say, the outflow of people who are affected by that tax, but the promise was made that that money would be kept separate. But those of us who are more critical of that plan said, look, money is fungible. If we reduce spending on one side of the ledger by $1 billion and increase it by on the other side by $1 billion, the net effect is this transportation education will get the same exact amount of money. It'll just look like it's come directly from the millionaire's tax. Is there any assurance that there's been no sort of reduction in the expenses targeted towards education and transportation in the basic budget before we then supplement it with the millionaire's tax?
There is a net increase in spending for both education and transportation. And I think one of the important or notable policy initiatives in Governor Healy's budget is to address the very thing you talked about, right? A lot of people said the money's fungible. It's not really going to result in more spending for either education or transportation. And her budget goes to great lengths to make sure that it actually does result in increased spending, because it sets up a separate trust fund. So the money from the income surtax is separated out, if you will, goes into a trust fund that has to be used for education and transportation.
Okay. All right. That's good. Well, at least the governor's heard our concerns. Perhaps she's a big listener of the podcast. Let's hope the legislatures share our concerns as
Yes.
well. So I want to talk also about healthcare. I learned from reading the budget that Mass Health is the biggest single item on the entire budget. But I think my big concern about healthcare is a lot of money came in from the federal government during COVID for obviously a huge demand for additional healthcare. And that money, I believe it's our emergency is supposed to expire on March or May 11th. I don't know what time of the day it's going to expire, but it will. Yeah. And some of that money is going to go away. So is this budget aware and does it make preparation for all those people who are relying on federal aid to now, that aid's going away? Say more about our health.
Yeah, sure. So Mass Health, the state's Medicaid program, as you say, is the biggest single line item in the budget. And the estimates vary, but it's roughly about 40% of the state budget. And so it's a big program, and any kind of expansion in eligible folks for it has a big impact on the budget. And because of the public health emergency that the federal government had declared during COVID and has continued and remains in effect to this day, there are a lot more people on Mass Health than there has been historically. About 400,000 people. And that's because the federal government said, hey, we're going to give you more money as part of our share of the cost. But in return, you can't kind of kick anyone off of the Mass Health program. And so right now, there are about 2.3 million people that are enrolled in the Mass Health program. And when that federal health emergency ends, they'll be able to begin what they called the recertification, and they're expecting that those numbers will decline by about 400,000 people.
To roughly the numbers they were trending before the COVID. So
yes,
we're not going to use the word kick off, but 400,000 people will be, let's say in the future, no longer eligible for what they were eligible for in COVID. And some of this funding is to sort of ease the pain, if you will, or create, I saw a mention of the term off-ramp from COVID. These are supplemental expenditures. How does that lay out? Is it just Mass Health, or are there other programs like it?
Well, Mass Health is certainly the largest one, and it has the greatest budgetary impact.
Okay, all right. So I'm starting from the big stuff and moving on down to the smaller stuff. Within the context of education, which is a huge element, there's a commitment again to educating the workforce. I see a lot of money dedicated to making sure folks go to college. Early education, we already talked about. Say more about how this reflects with what the governor thinks is important as far as education.
So education is a big priority of the Healy-Driscoll administration. And you can see that in the budget. As you say, they make investments really all along, the education spectrum. So starting with early education, there are investments in both provider rates and the amount of subsidies. You go to K through 12 education, and this budget fully funds the Student Opportunity Act, which means more money for the 351 cities and towns for school aid. We also spend a lot of money on community college, and there's a pretty new and novel program initiative, excuse me, called Mass Reconnect, which makes community college free for people over 25 who meet certain conditions. And then finally, there's a big investment in our higher education system with some of that money, as I had indicated before, from the income surtax. Some of that new money is devoted to higher ed.
We think education, clearly we're in Massachusetts. This is, the Athens of America. We like education in these parts.
Yeah.
But as far as community college, they have let's say, not a great track record as far as completion rates. Is there what we've talked about with education policy experts in the past is what could be even more effective might be vocational training and job training. Is there anything in there to help people become all those great services that all of us need?
There's certainly money for apprenticeship programs and for vocational tech. So I think that there is acknowledgement. There's also money for, it's called early college and career pathways, but the notion is you can help kids in high school either prepare better for college by taking some classes while they're still in high school to get acclimated and kind of used to the whole college scene, or you can help people who aren't going to college to have the skills they need for a career path. So there's money for that as well.
Okay, so we've been, I think I've been somewhat of a cheerleader for the governor so far in this budget. I'll say that if I had any concerns about the line items, I see there's a huge priority for what we're calling climate and environment. We all want to see a better environment. We don't like pollution, and we all want to do our part to help the climate. But I see there's sort of line items for training people in climate justice or environmental justice. This gives me concerns, but I want you to help me understand what that means. Why does the climate need to be? Do we need to consider justice in this environment?
Well, so what I would say, I mean, I think that the governor has said that she wants to make sure Massachusetts reaches its carbon emission reduction goals, which was set by Governor Baker by 2030. And so trying to provide resources to ensure we get there. But I do agree with you. I think the idea of the environmental justice is a little more kind of intangible, right? And not sure how that will all play out. The other thing I would say is, you had said you were a cheerleader for the budget, and I think there are a lot of great things in it too. But one thing I have noticed is there is a lot of money sprinkled throughout various state agencies and for various initiatives on things like training, workforce training. And I just hope that it's coordinated, right, and perhaps streamlined to make, and that there are measures of accountability, because we are spending a lot of money and want to make sure it's having the desired outcomes. And so, not quite sure what the goals of environmental justice folks would be, but I think that should be very transparent to taxpayers.
Yes, indeed. And almost, I think it's odd to me that when we do try to impose a stricter environmental standards, the unintended consequences to make building more expensive, which makes housing more expensive, which makes the cost of living more expensive. So when reading between the lines of the environmental justice, we're trying to make sure that we don't build, coal power plants in low opportunity neighborhoods. But of course, I think it gets the direction of that wrong. Low cost neighborhoods may be, let's say, less environmentally pure, but that's why they're low. That's why you can afford a house there. If you, in a sense, clean it up, you're essentially gentrifying and making those people who live there's lives, albeit cleaner and perhaps better for the environment, but they can't afford to live there anymore if there's a big, beautiful park. I'll enough with my editorializing. Okay, we've sort of covered the expense part, but we did say there's an attending budget a tax relief part of this, which is always music to all of our ears. We all like tax relief. Describe for our listeners the contours of the tax relief package.
Sure. So the governor campaigned on the notion that she acknowledged that Massachusetts is unaffordable and less competitive. And so she provided a tax package to address that. And it has several components, many of which were included in Governor Baker had filed a tax package, or they're concepts that the legislature had entertained. And there's really 5 big components to it. One is a dependent tax credit of $600, and that gets to trying to help with affordability of childcare or elder care. There's also an.
Can I just ask? Can I ask about the sure. Tax credit? It's one of my sticklers. Tax credit. It's effectively $600 if you have a child. It's $600 check, even if you pay no taxes, right? This is not offset your taxes. This is whether you pay taxes or not, you get that money.
Well, so you're right. A credit requires you to have tax liability. In this instance, it's a refundable tax credit. So if you don't have tax liability, you get a check from the government. Yes.
Okay. For our listeners, it's not your taxes will go down $600. If you pay nothing, you'll get a nice.
You'll get money. Yes.
Nice check. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then there's an increase in the senior circuit breaker, which is an offset on your income tax for property taxes paid. And there's an increase in the renter's deduction. So it used to be $3,000. It's bumped up to $4,000 is the maximum deduction that you can take on your income tax return. And then there is reform to the estate tax. So Massachusetts has a pretty onerous estate tax, one of 12 states to actually have one. And the governor goes a step further than certainly Governor Baker did in his proposal last legislative session, or that the House and Senate entertained. And I think that's an acknowledgement of passage of the income surtax, which we can talk about. And then the final provision is it reduces the tax rate on short-term capital gains from 12% to ordinary income tax rate of 5%.
Well, good. I'm glad we've landed here on talking about estate tax and capital gains tax, and you've sort of given a nod to the millionaires tax. If we have avid listeners who listen to every show, they'll know we were no fan of the millionaires tax, not because well, really for the only reason is it's likely have the effect of encouraging those who marginally want to stay but have considered leaving or retiring to Florida or moving to New Hampshire to avoid the income tax. But what you're describing is a sort of a counterbalance. So we've disincentivized high earners from living in Massachusetts. Now we're going to re-incentivize those who perhaps are in the estate range of $3 million or slightly above. And we're going to say, look, that first $3 million that you leave to your heirs is not going to be subject to an estate tax. For those people who, an average home in Massachusetts is starting to edge up towards $1 million. If they leave with any assets in their bank account, they're subject now to the millionaire's tax. As you know, it's if your estate is $1 more than $1 million, the tax is subject to $1, right? You have almost no threshold. Now you'll have what's effectively a $3 million threshold. I think that's going to have a healthy counterbalance. That's going to encourage quite a few, let's say, middle-class families from either staying in Massachusetts or considering moving to Florida. This may have a very salutary effect on those decisions. What are your thoughts?
So I don't disagree, right? And I think if you look at the governor's tax package, it was trying to do 2 things. It was trying to help those most struggling, so those that need help with their rent, or seniors, or young families with children, right? And so those provisions make sense. I think both the estate tax and the reduction in short-term capital gains was aimed at folks who may be considering leaving, as you say. And I think, and that is also acknowledging that the income surtax was enacted, right? And so people who are millionaires may be considering rearranging their affairs or leaving Massachusetts. And then if you add on the estate tax, when we're just one of 12 states with it, that may be kind of a 1-2 punch, right? And so the idea is to mitigate the impact of the estate tax. And this provision certainly does that and goes beyond what was considered last year. My only concern is it may not be enough to keep the really high income earners here if they're considering leaving, because while it makes it less onerous, Massachusetts still is only one of 12 states with any kind of estate tax.
That's right. And again, many of our listeners, perhaps those on the more progressive end of the ideological spectrum, say, well, let's impose a 5 cents cost of bags at the grocery store so people will bring their own. So 5 cents is supposed to incentivize you to bring your bags back to the grocery store, but imposing hundreds of thousands of dollars in estate tax isn't going to incentivize you to perhaps leave and go an hour north to New Hampshire or retire in sunny Florida. Incentives matter, and I think this may help slow the bleeding, but won't stop the bleeding. As you say, we are only one of 12 states, and the federal estate tax is much higher. I believe it's $12.3 million. Some states have normalized it with that. In a perfect world, that would truly put us in a much more competitive. If we're looking for wealthy seniors to remain here, that might be the better choice.
Well, and that would be certainly something I think that the state should consider. That's what Connecticut does. So we would be more competitive with Connecticut. But it would also ease compliance. It's just much simpler, right? If you pay, you figure out your estate tax according to the federal rules, and then it's essentially, taxed at the mass rate. So ease of compliance would be another consideration too.
And in discussing Massachusetts being a tax outlier, taxing capital gains rates short-term at a much higher rate than the short-term. I don't think any other state does that in the whole country. Again, this is your expertise, but am I right?
2 others do, and you know what? I didn't look it up, so my apologies for that. But it's certainly not typical, right? And so I think that that's another point that I tried to make in a recent blog. That yes, it certainly is a good step, but again, I question, is it enough? Because what it does is make Massachusetts aligned with other states, right? With respect to taxing short-term capital gains at the same rate they tax other capital gains or other income. And it helps, but I question whether it will make us sufficiently more competitive to move the needle.
Indeed. Again, I think the fact that, we really didn't talk about this, but we've moved from having a Republican governor who clearly understands Massachusetts must compete for jobs, for talent, with all 49 other states, and a new incoming Democratic governor. It's refreshing to know that she acknowledges that we have that competitive burden, right? We, without good, again, we've in earlier podcasts, we talk about how footloose or how able individual residents are able to move. And, in the distant past, people with no assets were the most likely to move around, the proverbial hobos that could get on trains and work anywhere. In our modern economy, it's almost the exact opposite. Your ability to move correlates with your income. The higher your income, the easier it is to pull up stakes and move to wherever you like. You've got the means to do it. So the more difficult we make it for high earners to stay, the more likely they are to stay or to leave. And we're making it harder and harder for them to stay. Do you agree with that observation?
Well, so yeah, I would say there are a couple of things going on, right? I think if you look at Massachusetts, we're a highly educated workforce, which means there are many white collar jobs which are able to be done remotely, right? And we saw that during COVID. Many companies didn't miss a beat. People were able to log in and work from home almost seamlessly. And that continues. So you are right about people are able to work, remotely more so than ever before, and they're choosing to do so because of either lower cost or higher quality of life or for whatever reason. And so Massachusetts has to worry about that because for a long time, we were losing our population, our natural born population, but we were backfilling that with immigration, right? And with college students who came to be educated and stayed. And we are seeing certainly less immigration because of COVID, because of federal immigration policies, or at least of immigration through either H-1B1 visas or that type of thing. And so it's really important that Massachusetts be competitive so we don't lose more of our population than we have been historically.
Yes, and of course, when you lose, if we tax someone so much that they take, say someone earning $5 million a year, when they leave, they take the additional tax you've just imposed, but also all the other taxes they had been paying before you raise their taxes. So
they do. And,
yeah.
and what I worry about is, because the cost of housing is high, that when people are starting out, is Massachusetts still a viable option for them? Or will they go to some place where the cost of housing is less and they're able to afford more of it? Because the other issue is if people are working from home or spending more time in their home, they want a little more room, right? And so having, the ability to buy as much house as you can may matter more than it did even a few years ago.
Indeed, they can move and they need to move because they need the wide open spaces. That's certainly low cost housing in wide open spaces is not something Massachusetts is known for. So, they go for greener pastures, both because they're getting hit on their paycheck with taxes and because they're getting hit in their wallets with an enormous mortgage. So good points right there. So we've done some cheerleading. We've done some criticizing of the governor's plan. I'd like to ask many of our guests, we're talking about somebody else's work. What if you were governor for a day or a year? What substantial differences would your budget look like? Would you change your priorities? You acknowledged that you would try to make us perhaps more competitive and less expensive, but how would you, in broad strokes, improve on this?
So first of all, I want to give kudos, to the governor, because I think she focused on the right things, right? We do need to address the cost of housing. We do need to fix our transportation. And I think the cost of early education, is a barrier to folks entering the workforce, right? So I think that those focuses are right. But what I would say is to fix education, to fix transportation, to fix housing, it takes a little while, right? It takes a while to permit and build housing. It takes a while to make capital investments in transportation. So some of the more immediate things that can be done are things like tax policy, which can be implemented fairly quickly and which could have a noticeable difference. And I think we've talked about some of them. I might have taken the reforms to the estate tax a little further. And I think lowering the rate on short-term capital gains, may make sense. Maybe it's reducing long-term capital gains rates to encourage more business type investment and so forth. And there are other costs that we can look at, we haven't talked about, but Massachusetts has high unemployment insurance costs, the highest in the nation. So maybe there are some reforms that can be done there. It's really about trying to reduce the cost of a job or hiring. So, some of that I think is important. Looking at healthcare costs, are there ways that we can potentially take some cost out of healthcare, because that is a huge expense, for families who are paying for commercial insurance. So that would be some of the things that I would look at.
Well, it's good. It sounds like you've just rattled off all the issues we've talked about in earlier podcast episodes. We try to tackle transportation, education, healthcare, one step at a time, but it's a big picture, and it's very, very, as you say, it's a long-term commitment to doing the right policy and making this great Commonwealth even better. So I appreciate. I'm thrilled to have had you. This is our first time together on the podcast. You're a new member of Pioneer. Oh, I haven't given us. I should have started at the top of the show. Where were you before you joined our esteemed organization?
So immediately prior, I was at the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, which is, it's a research organization focused on fiscal and economic stability for Massachusetts. And then,
okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
No, and I was just, and I've really spent my professional career on public policy in various capacities, focused on issues of importance to the employer community.
Good, I appreciate it. And again, there's a nonpartisan, and I hope we've tried to stick to our guns and remain nonpartisan in this review. I think we've done a thorough job. Where can our listeners go on to a website and drill down and learn more about the state budget? I think we can go to mass.gov or something like that. How will they get more detail on the
Yes, and so they can go to mass.gov, and you can look in one of two places. If you look under the legislature and you click on House or Senate, there's a whole tab devoted to the budget, and it takes you through each iteration. So that's a good place to look. But also, if you look under the executive branch, under Governor Healy's page, you'll see she has a click into her budget, and administration and finance is an executive agency that's really responsible for putting together the budget. They have a lot of information there as well.
Okay, and where can our listeners read what you're doing now for Pioneer?
On Pioneer's website.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Master of the obvious here. Well, thank you very much, Eileen. This has been a terrific first visit. I hope you'll consider joining me again in the future for future budget questions.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate the opportunity.
This has been another episode of HubWonk. If you enjoyed today's show, there are several ways to support HubWonk and Pioneer Institute. It would be easier for you and better for us if you subscribe to HubWonk on your iTunes podcatcher. If you want to help make it easier for others to find us, it would be great if you offer a 5-star rating or a favorable review. We're always grateful if you want to share HubWonk with friends. If you have ideas for me or comments or suggestions about future episode topics, you're welcome to email me at hubwonk@pioneerinstitute.org. Please join me next week for a new episode of HubWonk.